Cities of stench and shadows. You must imagine the medieval city not as the romantic dream painted in fairy tales, but as a living creature of stone, wood, and unending odor. Its narrow lanes wound like veins through a body too dense for its own health, and every breath you drew carried with it the mingling of smoke from hearths, dung from animals, and the faint sweetness of spices clutched by the wealthy. To walk those streets was to feel history pressing in. 1,000 lives contained within walls that rarely saw the cleansing hand of water. Cobblestones slick with refuse bore the marks of carts and boots, and rainwater ran in rivulets that carried more filth than clarity, for the very thought of clean water was a contradiction in that world. The city of the Middle Ages rose high with towers and church spires, and yet the greater height was balanced by the great heaviness of smell. For nobles, it was a world one could not escape, no matter how high the chamber, nor how fine the drapery. Perfumed oils burned in small lamps, pomanders hung at belts, and bundles of rosemary or lavender were clutched in gloved hands. But those were small victories, in a place where the very walls remembered centuries of smoke and rot. Houses leaned against each other like weary neighbors, their upper stories stretching out until the sunlight itself struggled to touch the street below. In that dimness, sound carried strangely the creak of wood, the groan of wheels, the constant murmur of voices seeking prayer or trade, and beneath it all, a hum of smells that one could neither escape nor wholly ignore. At the heart of these cities, nobles attempted to distance themselves from the press of ordinary life, but the distance was never complete. Within castles and grand manors, tapestries lined the walls to keep out the cold and the draught, but they also trapped scents, layer upon layer of meals, smoke, and humanity. In the kitchens, meat turned on spits, fish was salted or smoked, bread baked in great ovens, and each process left its own trace, weaving into the tapestry of odor that cloaked every chamber. Even the church, with its incense of frankincense and myrrh, could not entirely hide the earthy smells of the congregation kneeling on straw-covered floors. Holiness mingled with sweat, devotion with decay. For the noble who stepped outside his gates, the city was a place of contradiction. He might ride through the marketplace with silks fluttering and retainers marching, but the street itself would offer sights and scents unworthy of his grandeur. There were butchers carving animals in the open, their blood washing into the gutters. There were tanners soaking hides in foul mixtures, releasing odors so strong they marked entire districts. There were healers' stalls with dried herbs and jars of strange powders, their pungency almost a relief beside the sharper smells of refuse. All of this was the reality of medieval life. A city alive but unwashed, vibrant yet cloying. What made this world bearable for the noble class was not the absence of filth, but the art of concealment. Perfumed gloves, sachets filled with crushed flowers, and scented waters became as essential as food. To breathe through a pomander was to create a private world, however small, amidst the overwhelming stench. And yet, these gestures also revealed the paradox of the age. The higher one rose in rank, the more fragile one felt against the unseen dangers in the air. Nobles feared not just the smell, but what it carried, the belief that odors themselves were poisonous, that to inhale corruption was to invite death. Thus, the city was not only unpleasant but perilous, every whiff a reminder of mortality. Inside the noble homes, the attempts at control were relentless. Floors were scattered with rushes and herbs, replaced when they grew too foul, though often they remained until insects bred beneath them. Walls were painted or hung with rich fabric, but even the most splendid hall could not escape the faint musk of age. Servants scurried with buckets, sweeping and fumigating, yet the balance was never won. In winter, when windows were shuttered tight against the cold, the air grew thicker, heavy with human presence. In summer, when heat amplified every odor, windows thrown open admitted the street's chorus of smells, smoke, dung, sweat, and the rare drifting sweetness of a spice merchant's wares. The noble's world was one of hierarchy, even in smell. For the poor, the city's stench was endured without defense. For the wealthy, layers of protection were built in perfumes, herbs, and rituals. But no rank could erase it entirely. One could be seated on a gilded chair, draped in brocade, and still know that beneath the perfume of one's clothes lingered the faint reminder of a city unwashed. In this way, the atmosphere was democratic, touching all who breathed, a shared inheritance of medieval life. And so, the medieval city stood as both a marvel and a warning. Its cathedrals rose like prayers carved in stone, its markets pulsed with life and colour, but its air whispered the truth of an age that feared the water's touch. Within this shadowed, scented, and sometimes suffocating world, the story of bathing, or the lack of it, unfolded. For it was here, in the mingled air of beauty and decay, that nobles learned to replace cleansing with fragrance, to substitute ritual for hygiene, and to believe that to bathe too often was to invite death, the invisible enemy in water. To understand why nobles recoiled at the thought of washing, you must place yourself inside the mind of a medieval physician, a man robed in heavy cloth, clutching manuscripts copied from Galen or Aristotle, his chamber lined with herbs that hung from rafters like charms against unseen forces. For him, water was no blessing but a treacherous portal. It was believed that the human body was sealed by the skin, a fragile armor against disease. When water touched that barrier, it did not cleanse but weakened, opening pores and inviting invisible enemies to slip inside. The threat was not imagined in shadows alone, but proclaimed in universities and pulpits alike, reinforced by the authority of both science and faith. To bathe too often was, in their eyes, to gamble recklessly with one's very life. The Great Plague of the 14th century had burned this fear into memory with a terror that did not fade. When the Black Death swept across Europe, people sought explanations for the calamity, and one answer was that miasma's poisonous airs had entered through vulnerable bodies. Clean water, paradoxically, was thought to soften the skin and widen the pores, making them receptive to corruption. Priests warned congregations not to expose themselves. Healers prescribed fumigation, not immersion. Even the most powerful kings were not immune to such reasoning, for death had touched palaces as readily as hovels. Thus, water became not a symbol of purity but a whisper of mortality. Nobles therefore turned their fear into habit. They learned to shield themselves not by washing, but by surrounding their lives with dry rituals. Clothing, changed frequently, was believed to absorb sweat and carry away impurities. Herbs placed in cushions or sewn into garments were thought to repel illness as strongly as they masked odor. Physicians instructed nobles to cleanse only the face and hands with cloths dipped in scented vinegar, for vinegar was sharp enough to bite at corruption, while sparing the body from water's supposed danger. A noble lady might dab her wrists with rosewater, believing it to refresh her complexion without weakening her defenses. A noble lord might hold a pomander to his nose, trusting that each breath of spice was safer than any immersion in a bath. The church's voice strengthened the fear. Preachers declared that the body, when pampered by water, grew soft and sinful. To wash too often was vanity, a form of pride that lured the soul into temptation. Monks debated whether the comfort of bathing was a luxury, unworthy of the faithful, and in many places the conclusion was grim. Abstinence from water was a mark of virtue. Only baptism was sanctified by the church, for that was not cleansing of dirt, but washing of sin. All other immersions were suspect, too close to indulgence, too near to lust. Thus, when nobles avoided water, they did so not merely from medical caution, but with the weight of heaven's warning upon their shoulders. Yet fear did not silence curiosity, and so in certain corners, physicians experimented with controlled bathing. They suggested lukewarm water, mixed with herbs, carefully measured, perhaps allowed once or twice a year for the restoration of balance. Even then, it was not done casually, but as a treatment, a remedy against melancholy or stiffness of joints. The noble who bathed did so under watchful eyes, wrapped quickly afterward in blankets, lest the pores remain open to the draught. To them, the chill air was a thief, eager to rob the body of warmth and replace it with sickness. In this way, the act of bathing became not an act of cleanliness, but of danger, narrowly avoided. Imagine a noble child standing before a basin, the servants hesitating before pouring water over delicate skin. The mother watches, fearful, for too much could harm the child, and too little might offend propriety. So the cloth is dipped lightly, wrung nearly dry, and brushed across the cheeks or hands, nothing more. The act is symbolic, a nod toward purity without risking the invisible dangers lurking in every drop. Such was the rhythm of daily life, where cleanliness was measured not by soap and water, but by rituals of caution, prayers against corruption, and the ever-present fear of what flowed unseen through streams and wells. The irony of the age was profound. Water, the essence of life, was treated as if it were poison. Rivers ran beside the city walls, wells stood in the courtyards, yet nobles shied away, preferring to trust in perfumes and powders. The poor, who could not afford such luxuries, sometimes bathed in rivers regardless, but they were despised for their recklessness, their seeming lack of fear. Nobles looked upon such acts with both disdain and envy, disdain for the supposed ignorance of peasants, envy for their courage in touching what the wealthy dared not. But in their world, knowledge was shaped by authority, and authority had spoken clearly. Clean water carried invisible dangers, and only the foolish would embrace it. Thus the medieval noble's life unfolded beneath the shadow of this conviction. To wash was to risk was to invite death. The city already pressed upon them with odours and disease. Why offer the body's last defence to its mercy? Better to wrap oneself in linen, surround the senses with fragrance, and pray that the invisible enemy remained at bay. And so fear became habit, habit became custom, and custom hardened into the peculiar truth of the Middle Ages, that water, clear and pure to the eye, was more feared than filth itself. Perfume as a protective charm. In the hushed chambers of castles and manors, where tapestries dulled the winter winds and candlelight flickered across carved beams, nobles reached for their defence against the unseen terrors of the air. Fragrance. To them, scent was no mere luxury, but a weapon, a shield woven of herbs, resins, and oils, guarding the body from corruption. Physicians whispered that good smells drove away pestilence, for foul air carried disease and sweet air repelled it. Priests murmured that the soul might be steadied by the fragrance of holy oils. Thus, from the king upon his throne to the lady in her tower, the noble world wrapped itself in a haze of perfume, as if each breath of spice and flower were a prayer against death. Pomanders were the most faithful companions in this crusade of scent. These small spheres of silver or gold opened like treasure chests, holding within them little balls of ambergris, clove-studded oranges, or mixtures of musk and rose petals. Nobles wore them on chains at their waist or held them in their gloved hands, lifting them to their faces when the air grew too heavy with the odours of the street. A duke might ride through the market with a pomander dangling at his side, its fragrance battling the smell of tanners and butchers. A countess, walking in her garden, might pause to breathe the softened, spiced air within her pomander, believing it a shield as much as a pleasure. To breathe perfume was, in their eyes, to fortify the lungs and close the body to sickness. Beyond these charms, rooms themselves became battlegrounds of fragrance. Floors were scattered with dried herbs, lavender, mint, marjoram, and thyme, their scent rising when trodden upon, masking less pleasant smells and promising safety. In wealthier halls, braziers burned incense or resin, filling the chamber with sweet smoke, curling in patterns that seemed to sanctify the air. Nobles believed that this fumigation not only refreshed the senses but purified the space, driving out corrupt airs like demons banished from holy ground. Guests entered such rooms and breathed deeply, reassured that the host had taken steps to guard against invisible threats. Perfumed gloves became a fashion as well as a defense. Tanned in aromatic oils, these gloves scented the wearer's skin, so that when a noble raised a hand in greeting, the fragrance lingered in the air. To kiss such a glove was to taste not sweat or leather but the sweetness of rose or violet. Women anointed their hair with oils of jasmine or rosemary, turning each movement into a release of fragrance. Men combed their beards with ointments of musk or civet. In every gesture, scent proclaimed wealth, elegance, and above all, safety, for only those with means could command the costly trade in perfumes and spices that flowed from the east. This trade itself was steeped in wonder. Caravans crossed deserts with bundles of frankincense and myrrh. Ships sailed from distant ports with chests of cinnamon, nutmeg, and sandalwood. To possess these was to hold the world within one's chamber. to draw strength from lands beyond the horizon. Perfumes carried not only scent but stories, of bazaars in Cairo, of harbours in Venice, of markets where merchants bargained in dozens of tongues. To sprinkle spice upon a dish, or to anoint oneself with rare oil was to wear the mark of power, proof that one's household commanded the riches of trade. Thus, fragrance was both talisman and trophy. Yet there was also intimacy in this world of scents. A noble lady might press a sachet of dried violets into her lover's hand, a charm to carry against the pestilence. A mother might place lavender in the cradle, believing its fragrance would shield her child. Letters were often scented with rosewater before being sealed, so that the message carried not only words but invisible protection. Even prayer books, opened in solemn devotion, released the faint sweetness of herbs pressed between their pages. In every corner of noble life, fragrance seeped like a second language, a way of speaking safety and affection without words. Still, beneath the charm and beauty lay the shadow of fear. Nobles did not wear perfume merely to delight the senses, but because they believed the very air conspired against them. Sweet smells were shields, foul smells were threats. A sudden stench in the street could send a noble retreating behind his pomander, convinced that death lurked within the odor. Physicians encouraged this belief, prescribing perfumes as medicine, urging their patients to inhale the smoke of juniper or drink water infused with mint and cloves. Illness, they said, could be warded off if only the senses were kept vigilant, if only sweet smells outweighed the corruption. Thus, in the courts and chambers of the Middle Ages, fragrance became both armor and adornment. To the modern mind, it may seem strange that perfume could replace water, that musk and ambergris could stand where soap and bathing did not. Yet in the world of the medieval noble, this was not folly but wisdom, passed down in books, affirmed by priests, and reinforced by the harsh memory of plague. And so they lived within a cloud of perfume, trusting that each breath of sweetness carried them further from the shadow of death. The single bath of the year. Picture the scene within the cold stone walls of a medieval castle, where the great hall echoed with footsteps and whispered preparations, for the day of the bath was approaching. It was not an everyday convenience, nor even a monthly indulgence, but a ritual so rare and solemn that it bore the weight of ceremony. Nobles did not bathe lightly, for to immerse oneself in water was to step into danger, and so the annual bath was approached with the same reverence one might give to a feast day or a holy rite. Servants moved with careful precision, carrying wooden tubs lined with cloth, hauling heated water from the kitchens in steaming pails, while the lord or lady prepared as if to meet both purification and peril. The bath itself was an elaborate affair, as much performance as practice. A great wooden vessel, often crafted with hoops of iron to hold its form, was placed in a chamber specially prepared, its floor strewn with herbs to mask unpleasant odours. Water, heated in cauldrons, was poured into the tub until steam rose into the air, mingling with the scent of rosemary, thyme, or chamomile, tossed in for both fragrance and supposed protection. The noble did not enter alone, for attendants hovered nearby, guarding against the dangers physicians warned of. Too hot a water might weaken the body, too cold a draught might kill, and too long a soak might unbalance the humours. Thus, every gesture was watched, measured, and conducted with a sense of anxious care. For the noble, stepping into the bath was a strange blend of relief and unease. The warm water, wrapping the body in unfamiliar softness, offered a fleeting pleasure, but it was laced with dread. One could almost hear the words of learned men echoing in the mind, that pores opened wide invited sickness, that the body, softened by water, became fragile, vulnerable, and so the bath was brief, carefully timed, like a dangerous medicine taken in measured dose. Attendants stood ready with thick linen cloths to wrap the bather the moment he or she emerged, lest the slightest chill undo all precautions. Candles burned steadily, warding off shadows, while herbs smouldered in braziers to keep the air sweet and safe. Yet in its rarity, the bath was also spectacle. The lord might invite favoured guests to witness the preparation, to see how the household upheld the dignity of its master. The lady might receive her attendants in the bathing chamber, speaking softly as water was poured over her shoulders, a scene both intimate and theatrical. Perfumed oils were brought forth to anoint the skin afterward, powders applied to cheeks, hair combed and scented, until the ritual had transformed the body into something refreshed, though not necessarily cleansed in the way the modern world might expect. Cleanliness, in their eyes, was not the absence of dirt but the presence of fragrance and the careful management of bodily balance. For children of noble birth, the annual bath was treated with even greater caution. The young body, fragile and easily unsettled, was thought to be especially at risk from the dangers of water. Warm milk or wine might be added to the bath to strengthen the child, herbs chosen with care to calm the humours, and the soaking kept shorter still. Mothers prayed as their infants were lowered into the water, eyes fixed on the child's face for any sign of distress, hearts anxious until the ordeal was complete. Once dried and wrapped, the child was held close, as though rescued from a trial by fire. The memory of these baths lingered in the household, their rarity giving them weight. Servants might speak of the year's bath with awe, recalling the scent of herbs that filled the chamber, or the way their lord's face shone afterward, powdered and perfumed. For the noble, the bath became a marker in time, a moment when one risked danger for the promise of renewal. And in a world where sickness struck without warning, where death lingered in every season, even such small rituals became significant. The annual bath was not merely hygiene but an affirmation that life, however precarious, could still be touched by ceremony and care. There were those, of course, who defied the custom, who bathed more often, influenced perhaps by foreign practices or personal inclination, but they were exceptions, whispered about as strange or reckless. The greater part of nobility clung to the ritual of rarity, their once-a-year bath a symbol of prudence and restraint. To immerse oneself, too often, was indulgence. To avoid bathing altogether was neglect. Between these extremes lay the careful balance of the medieval world, where even water, most natural of elements, was both feared and revered. Thus, the annual bath stood as a paradox, feared for its danger, cherished for its rarity, cloaked in ritual, and remembered as one of the few moments when the noble body touched water in earnest. And when it was done, when the tub was emptied, the linens dried, and the perfumes reapplied, life returned to its normal rhythm of dry cleanliness, perfumes, and prayers. The noble would not step into water again until another year had turned, and another ritual was prepared. Bathhouses of sin and suspicion. While nobles clung to their rare and private bathing rituals, there existed in the towns and cities another world, the bathhouse. These places, built of timber or stone and warmed by great furnaces, promised warmth, immersion, and conversation. To the poor, they were a rare comfort, offering access to water and steam when homes had neither. To merchants and artisans, they were social halls, where business was discussed and deals struck as bodies soaked together. But to nobles, and to the watchful eyes of the church, bathhouses carried a darker reputation. They were houses not of cleanliness, but of temptation, sin, and contagion. The air inside a medieval bathhouse was heavy with steam. Men and women, sometimes separated by walls, sometimes not at all, entered the heated rooms with towels wrapped around their bodies, lowering themselves into great tubs or pools. The warmth soothed the skin, the scent of herbs floated from the water, and for a moment the weary city dweller could believe that he had found comfort amidst hardship. Yet this very comfort drew suspicion. Priests thundered from pulpits that such indulgence softened the soul, made the body crave pleasure, and turned hearts away from prayer. Physicians warned that in the mingling of many bodies, diseases multiplied, slipping easily from one bather to another. And nobles, ever fearful of both scandal and sickness, looked upon bathhouses with narrowed eyes. There was reason for suspicion. Records from across Europe tell of bathhouses doubling as meeting places for illicit trysts. Candlelight flickered on damp walls, shadows concealed more than they revealed, and laughter carried through the steam with undertones of secrecy. Prostitutes found their trade among the baths, offering more than simple comfort, and moralists declared such places nests of corruption. Even the word bathhouse became a whisper of vice, associated less with cleansing than with sin. Town councils debated their presence, bishops called for their closure, and yet, for centuries, they persisted, for people still craved the relief of heat and water. Nobles sometimes visited these places, though rarely openly. A lord might disguise himself, slipping into the steamy rooms to experience what his class disdained, or a lady might, under the pretense of a cure, seek the warmth that her chamber could not provide. But these visits were risky, for to be seen in such places invited gossip and condemnation. If a noble emerged sick after bathing among the common folk, tongues wagged that he had been punished for vanity. If a lady was rumoured to have gone, whispers followed her, staining her reputation. Thus, the bathhouse, though common in cities, became a forbidden space for the high-born, alluring yet dangerous, a symbol of all that nobles feared about water. And yet, beneath the suspicion lay the truth that bathhouses once held greater respect. In earlier centuries, inspired by Roman tradition, many cities maintained public baths as places of health and cleanliness. Some were even built near monasteries, where monks encouraged bathing as part of care for the sick. But as plague and disease spread through Europe, attitudes shifted. Water, once linked to health, became linked to contagion. To bathe, among others, was to risk inhaling their corrupted airs, to open oneself to their ailments. Physicians recorded outbreaks that followed gatherings in bathhouses, and so suspicion hardened into certainty. The bathhouse was not safety, but peril. Still, the lure remained. In Germany, bathhouses thrived well into the late Middle Ages, offering tubs, food, and even music. In England, they clustered along the river, drawing crowds despite prohibitions. In France, they were woven into the fabric of urban life, too deeply rooted to be erased by edicts alone. People needed warmth, they needed comfort, and they sought it even when warned that such comfort was sinful. Thus, the bathhouse became a symbol of contradiction, at once a place of healing and harm, of community and corruption, of cleanliness and contagion. For the noble observing from afar, the bathhouse confirmed their fears about water. It was not the privacy of their guarded tub, where servants controlled every detail, but a crowded, steamy chamber where bodies mingled freely. It represented the opposite of control, the surrender of order to indulgence. And in a world where order was prized, where rank and ritual shaped every gesture, such surrender was intolerable. Better to avoid water altogether than to be seen within those walls. Better to cling to perfumes and powders, to linen and ritual, than to risk both body and soul in the baths of the city. Thus, the bathhouse lived on the margins of noble life, tolerated, condemned, but never wholly destroyed. It was a reminder that not all shared the noble fear of water, that for many, immersion remained a comfort too sweet to relinquish. And yet, in the noble mind, it stood forever tainted, a place where the scent of rosemary could not hide the presence of sin, where steam concealed whispers of disease, and where the promise of cleansing was always shadowed by suspicion. Clothing as a fortress. Step now into the chamber of a medieval noble, and you will see that the true barrier between the body and the world was not water, nor even perfume, but cloth. Layer upon layer, garment upon garment, each piece was chosen not only for display but for defense. The noble's wardrobe was more than fashion. It was armor against the unseen dangers that lingered in the air. In an age when bathing was rare and feared, clothing itself became the means of cleanliness, protection, and separation from the foulness of the city and the weakness of the body. First came the linen, the soft white undergarment that touched the skin. Woven with care, bleached in the sun, and laundered more often than any other item, linen was prized for its purity. Physicians taught that it absorbed sweat and drew impurities from the flesh, leaving the body refreshed without the hazard of water. To change one's linen was to cleanse oneself, to remove the invisible corruption of the day and begin anew. Nobles therefore maintained vast stores of linen, tended by laundresses who carried bundles to streams or boiling tubs, scrubbing, drying, and pressing them until they shone. The smell of fresh linen was, to the medieval nose, as reassuring as the scent of soap is today. Over the linen came layers of wool, silk, or velvet, depending on wealth and season. Each layer added weight and warmth, but also another barrier against the dangerous world. Drafts, those feared messengers of illness, could not easily pierce through so many folds, nor could foul odours penetrate to the body, at least in belief, for the garments themselves absorbed what the skin must not. For men, this meant doublets, hose, cloaks, and surcoats, each fastened carefully. For women, gowns of multiple skirts, bodices laced tight, sleeves long and flowing, all covering the body so completely that little was left bare to the eye or the air. To dress was to build a fortress around the self, a bastion of cloth against corruption. With each garment came not only physical protection but symbolic power. Rich fabrics spoke of wealth and rank, and so the fortress of clothing was also a display of superiority. A noble who dressed in heavy brocades and furs announced both his fortune and his safety, for he could afford the means to shield himself from the perils of the world. Even the act of layering carried significance. More layers meant greater care, more distance from dirt, more assurance that the body was safeguarded. A peasant in coarse wool, bare-legged and unwashed, seemed exposed, vulnerable, almost reckless in the noble eye. Thus, class distinction was reinforced by the very fabric that covered the body. But clothing was not merely armor against disease, it was also a mask for odor. Without frequent baths, the human body carried its own pungent truths. Garments absorbed these, yes, but they also concealed them beneath scented sachets sewn into hems or powders sprinkled between layers. A noblewoman might tuck a pouch of dried lavender into her bodice, letting its fragrance mingle with the warmth of her body. A nobleman might rub his doublet with cedar oil, ensuring that when he entered a hall, he brought with him the smell of forests rather than sweat. In this way, clothing became not only a barrier but a vessel, carrying perfumes close to the skin and broadcasting them to the air. The sheer labor required to maintain this fortress was immense. Servants brushed and beat garments to remove dust, repaired seams worn by the weight of fabric, and kept closets filled with herbs to repel moths and vermin. Laundresses boiled linens in great vats, sometimes with ashes or lye, scrubbing until their hands were raw. Tailors stitched endlessly, altering garments to layer more snugly, or expanding them when fashions changed. Behind the noble's fortress of cloth lay an army of workers, unseen but essential, their toil the true foundation of noble cleanliness. Even in sleep, the fortress remained. Nobles did not lie bare beneath their blankets, but wore night garments of linen, ensuring that skin remained shielded, pores covered, dangers kept at bay. In winter, when cold draughts prowled through castles, extra layers were added, for to be struck by chill while the body lay exposed was thought to invite sudden death. In summer, lighter linens sufficed, but still the principle held. The body was never truly bare, never wholly open to the world. The fortress must remain intact, even in rest. The weight of these garments shaped the noble body itself. To move in layers of wool, velvet, and fur required bearing and strength. A woman's gowns trained her posture, straight and restrained, while a man's surcoats and cloaks demanded dignity in movement. Children were dressed likewise, wrapped in miniature fortresses of linen and wool, taught from infancy that to be noble was to be clothed, shielded, and separated from danger. Nakedness was not freedom but peril, a state reserved for the poorest and the most reckless. Thus, in every stitch and seam, medieval clothing told a story. It was the story of a world that mistrusted water, that placed its faith in barriers and coverings, that saw in cloth both protection and power. To the noble, clothing was more than appearance, it was life itself, the wall that stood between health and illness, between order and chaos. And so they lived encased, moving through cities of stench and shadows wrapped in their fortresses of fabric, trusting that each layer kept them one step further from the invisible dangers that haunted the air. The white undergarment as ablution. In a world where water was distrusted, the act of cleanliness was reimagined, and at the very heart of this reinvention stood the humble linen undergarment. Though simple in appearance, it was revered by nobles as the truest substitute for bathing, a fabric so pure and so carefully tended that it seemed to carry away impurity itself. To change linen was to wash without water, to step into new garments was to be reborn, and so the white undergarment became a kind of silent sacrament, a daily ablution in a society that feared immersion. The logic, as taught by physicians and embraced by nobles, was clear. The linen drew sweat and filth out of the body, absorbing what the skin could not safely release. The pores, once opened by exertion or heat, were vulnerable, but linen acted as a barrier, pulling away the harmful substances before they could fester within. When a noble awoke in the morning, servants stood ready with fresh garments of soft, whitened cloth, and to slip into them was as refreshing as any plunge into water might seem today. The discarded garments, heavy with odour and stain, were whisked away by laundresses, who bore the burden of transforming them back into purity. The laundresses' work was arduous, their lives spent by riversides or around great steaming vats. Linen was boiled with ashes or soapwort, beaten with wooden paddles, stretched upon frames beneath the sunday. The brightness of well-laundered linen was a mark of both wealth and devotion, for to maintain such garments required resources and labour. Nobles did not soil their hands with such tasks. They simply demanded that each day fresh linen should appear, as if by miracle, crisp and white, smelling faintly of the outdoors or of herbs dried in storerooms. Cleanliness, for them, was not measured in baths, but in the assurance that their linen had been renewed, and there was symbolism in this whiteness. Linen, gleaming against the skin, became a sign of virtue, of purity, both physical and moral. Churchmen praised its brightness as an outward echo of inward chastity, though they often warned against vanity in its display. A nobleman might reveal the collar of his linen beneath his doublet, proof that he lived rightly and cared for his body's sanctity. A noblewoman might allow the edge of her chemise to show, embroidered delicately, a quiet declaration that she was kept clean without indulgence in forbidden waters. Thus, linen was not only practical but moral, a visible boundary between prudence and sin. Within the rhythms of noble life, linen took on ritual importance. After feasts, when the air was thick with meat and wine, nobles changed into fresh undergarments to banish the heaviness from their bodies. Before prayers, they donned whitened linen as if preparing for spiritual as well as physical renewal. In times of illness, physicians instructed more frequent changes, believing that foul substances could be drawn out more swiftly if the body was wrapped in new fabric. Even in death, nobles were laid in clean linen shrouds, carried into the grave, wrapped in the same fabric that had guarded their bodies in life. There was intimacy, too, in the handling of linen. Servants and laundresses, entrusted with these garments, shared a knowledge of the noble body that few others possessed. They saw the marks of sweat and strain, the stains of illness or indulgence, the silent traces left upon the fabric. To them, linen was a record of life, a testament written in threads and shadows, yet their task was to erase it, to return the garment to a state of unblemished purity, so that their masters could believe that filth had been truly carried away. In this endless cycle of soiling and renewal, linen itself became a kind of baptism repeated daily, a washing without water. Nobles invested deeply in their linen stores. Chests filled with dozens, even hundreds of garments were treasured as much as jewels or tapestries. Inventories of estates list not only gold and silver, but the number of linen sheets, shirts, chemises, and undergarments, for these were wealth as real as coin. To be surrounded by clean linen was to live securely, to know that one could face the dangers of odour and impurity armed with a fortress that was renewed each dawn. The poor, who might own only one or two pieces, were seen as perpetually unclean, unable to partake in this cycle of purification. Class distinction was written not only in fine silks but in the daily blessing of fresh linen. And so, in a paradox that seems strange to modern eyes, the noble of the Middle Ages could step confidently into a hall, perfumed and arrayed, without having touched water for months, yet still feel clean. It was the linen that had absorbed the body's excess, the linen that had been laundered in fire and river, the linen that proclaimed purity to the world. Each day was marked not by soap and bath, but by the silent ritual of changing clothes. In this way, the undergarment became more than fabric. It was the noble second skin, their shield, their proof of cleanliness in a world that feared the very element from which all life flows: blood, bile, and the four humours. To understand why nobles of the Middle Ages held such suspicion toward water and bathing, you must step into the world of their medicine, a system inherited from the ancients and bound tightly to the rhythms of body and cosmos. Physicians, trained in universities and monasteries, carried in their minds the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, voices from centuries past whose words were treated not as suggestion but as law. According to them, the body was a delicate vessel governed by four humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Health depended upon balance, and sickness came when one humour outweighed the others. Every treatment, every prescription, every piece of advice flowed from this belief, and bathing was no exception. The humours were linked to the elements and to the seasons. Blood was hot and moist, tied to air and to spring. Yellow bile was hot and dry, ruled by fire and summer. Black bile was cold and dry, allied with earth and autumn. Phlegm was cold and moist, bound to water and to winter. The noble body was thought to be constantly shifting beneath these influences, its stability as fragile as a flame in the wind. A bath, far from being a simple refreshment, was seen as an intervention that might tilt the balance disastrously. Warm water could make blood surge, causing fevers or nosebleeds. Cold water might summon phlegm, bringing lethargy or deathly chills. To submerge oneself was to stir the humours into motion, and few dared to do so without fear. Physicians prescribed bathing only under strict conditions, as if administering a dangerous drug. If the body was judged too hot, a short immersion in tepid water might be allowed to cool it. If it was too dry, oils might be added, rubbed onto the skin to restore moisture. Yet these treatments were rare and often confined to the sick. For the healthy noble, the advice was clear: maintain balance by avoiding extremes, and bathing was an extreme indeed. Better to regulate the body with food, with rest, with controlled bleeding or purging, than to expose it recklessly to the uncertain element of water. This belief seeped into every corner of noble life. Meals were planned according to humours: light foods in summer to counter heat, heavy meats in winter to fight cold. Wines were chosen for their qualities: red to warm, white to cool, and spices added to tilt the scales as needed. When illness struck, physicians prescribed not immersion, but bloodletting, to drain excess humours, or poultices of herbs to draw out imbalance. Against such elaborate systems, bathing appeared crude, even dangerous. Why soak the body and risk disturbing all four humours at once, when one could treat each with precise remedies? The language of humours also shaped the way nobles spoke of themselves and others. A man quick-tempered was said to be filled with choler, or yellow bile. A melancholy lady was believed to suffer from too much black bile. The sluggish were phlegmatic, burdened by cold moisture. The passionate were sanguine, their blood too lively. To bathe recklessly was to risk changing not only one's health, but one's very temperament, altering the balance of spirit as well as flesh. Thus, water carried not only physical danger, but the threat of reshaping character itself. And so, when nobles prepared their rare baths, they did so under medical counsel, with herbs carefully chosen to guide the humours. Rosemary might warm, chamomile might soothe, sage might purify. A physician might test the noble's pulse, study his urine, examine his complexion before declaring whether the bath should be hot, cold, brief, or avoided altogether. The act of immersion became a medical procedure, overseen with solemnity, never undertaken lightly. Even afterward, precautions abounded, wrapping the body quickly in cloth, serving warming drinks to restore balance, forbidding exposure to air until the humours had settled. This constant awareness of balance extended beyond medicine into the rhythms of the year. Spring was a time of renewal, when blood rose and fevers threatened. Bathing was especially risky then. Summer's heat inflamed the body, making water seem both tempting and perilous. Autumn, with its melancholy airs, demanded caution lest black bile grow strong. Winter's chill weighed heavily with phlegm, and to immerse oneself in water then was nearly unthinkable. Thus, the calendar itself spoke against frequent bathing, reinforcing the habit of rarity. What is striking to the modern mind is not merely the fear of water, but the confidence with which these theories were held. To the noble, the four humours were as real as bone and blood. They explained not only illness, but personality, fortune, and fate. To defy them was folly, to ignore them was to court disaster. And so, bathing became entwined with this ancient system. bound by its rules and fears. A noble might long for refreshment, might crave the feeling of water upon skin, but the voice of the physician, the authority of tradition, and the shadow of imbalance whispered louder. In this way, the theory of the four humours shaped not only medicine but daily habit, weaving itself into clothing, diet, ritual, and thought. It justified the avoidance of water, made cleanliness a matter of linen and perfume, and lent weight to the belief that immersion was perilous. Behind every noble's decision not to bathe stood centuries of inherited wisdom, the authority of scholars, and the invisible pull of humours shifting within the body. And so, fear of imbalance joined fear of disease, until the very idea of frequent bathing seemed not only strange but reckless, a defiance of the natural order itself. Kings, drenched in fragrance. If nobles feared the water, their monarchs set the tone, for the habits of kings and queens echoed through every court and manor, shaping the standards of an entire realm. And what a curious example they offered. These rulers, wrapped in ermine and crowned with gold, lived their days in an atmosphere thick with perfumes, powders, and scented gloves, yet many of them passed years without immersing themselves in a true bath. To be close to a medieval monarch was to breathe not the freshness of soap and water, but the mingled aromas of costly oils, the musk of furs, and the lingering shadow of unwashed flesh, disguised by fragrance. Their bodies became living symbols of power clothed in finery, adorned with jewels, yet curiously fragile and human beneath, like everyone else. Stories of royal bathing or its absence circulated widely, often recorded with fascination or disbelief. In France, King Louis XIV, the Sun King, was said to detest bathing so thoroughly that he avoided full immersion for nearly his entire life. Instead, he relied on linen and perfumes, changing his undergarments several times a day and drenching himself in colognes and scented oils. His skin, it was whispered, rarely touched water, yet he was always enveloped in a cloud of fragrance so powerful that courtiers remarked on it long after he had left a room. He was not unique. In Spain, Queen Isabella of Castile was said to have confessed that she had bathed only twice in her life, once at birth and once before her wedding. These tales, whether exaggerated or faithfully true, reflected a deeper reality. The highest examples of nobility confirmed the belief that water was not to be trusted, and yet, even as they avoided the bath, these monarchs cultivated ritual and display around the idea of cleanliness. To be king or queen was to embody order, to show that one's person was a reflection of divine right, untainted by the chaos of the common world. Thus, while they shunned immersion, they surrounded themselves with practices that suggested purity. Their linen was washed with extraordinary care, bleached until it shone, and changed with ceremonial precision. Their chambers were filled with sachets of dried rose petals and herbs, cushions stuffed with lavender, and candles scented with amber. Physicians prescribed elaborate regimens of perfumed cloths, rubbed upon the body to refresh the skin, and cosmetics were applied to faces to preserve the illusion of brightness and health. The result was not true cleanliness, but a carefully curated image of it. Royal courts became theatres of fragrance. To enter the presence of a monarch was to be enveloped in an atmosphere that announced wealth as much as power. The perfumes used were costly, drawn from the distant reaches of trade. Frankincense, from Arabia, ambergris carried from the seas, musk brought by caravans from the east. These scents were themselves political statements, proof that the ruler commanded not only armies but also the riches of the world. When a king walked through his hall, his cloak trailing behind him, it carried not just fabric, but the invisible aura of exotic lands. The perfume clinging to his garments whispered of dominion over seas and deserts, of caravans and ships bound to his will. The irony, of course, was that beneath these layers of fragrance, monarchs were often no cleaner than their humblest subjects. Courtiers sometimes remarked, in hushed tones, on the earthy smells that rose despite the perfumes, on the heaviness of air in royal chambers. Yet few dared to speak openly, for to criticize the body of a king was to risk one's life. Instead, admiration was voiced for the richness of his perfumes, the brilliance of his garments, the luster of his skin carefully painted with powders. Appearances mattered more than realities, and fragrance was the veil that transformed the mortal body into something near divine. Rituals reinforced this transformation. In some courts, the monarch's morning dressing became a public ceremony, the lever du roi, where nobles gathered to witness their king rise and be robed. Each layer of linen, each application of oil, each dab of perfume was not only practical but symbolic, a reminder that the king's body was not his own but the body of the realm. Cleanliness, such as it was, became part of the performance of power. The monarch might never enter a bath, but in the eyes of his court he was continually purified by ritual, by fragrance, and by divine rite. And so, when stories of royal habits spread, they shaped the conduct of nobles everywhere. If kings and queens did not bathe, who among the lesser lords could dare to defy that example? If monarchs trusted in linen, perfume, and ritual, then such must be the proper path of prudence. Thus, the aversion to water found its strongest reinforcement at the top of the social order, cascading down through dukes, counts, and knights, until it settled into the very fabric of noble life. Cleanliness was no longer about water at all, but about ceremony, clothing, and the invisible armor of scent. Yet even in this world, whispers of doubt persisted. Foreign travelers, coming from lands where bathing was more common, often wrote in astonishment of Europe's rulers and their avoidance of water. To them, it seemed a contradiction. How could the most powerful men and women on earth fear what was so natural, so essential? But in the halls of medieval Europe, the answer was clear. To immerse oneself was to invite imbalance, illness, or sin. To perfume oneself was to proclaim strength, wealth, and divine favor. And so the kings and queens of the Middle Ages walked their halls drenched in fragrance, their bodies unwashed, their power cloaked not in water but in the smoke of incense and the sweetness of oils. Seasons of washing and worship. To the noble mind, cleanliness was not tethered to the calendar of days or weeks as it is for you, but rather to the long rhythm of seasons and the sacred pulse of the church year. Time itself seemed to breathe differently in the Middle Ages, measured less by the hours of a clock than by feast days, harvests, and holy observances. So too did the habits of washing and changing garments follow this cadence, bound to the turn of the year and to the guidance of priests and physicians alike. A noble did not ask when last he had bathed, but whether the season or the holy day made it safe, whether the body's humours aligned with the time ordained by heaven. Spring was a moment of cautious renewal. As the world thawed, physicians warned that blood rose within the body, stirring fevers and passions. To bathe at this time was considered perilous, for the warmth of water might inflame the blood further. Instead, nobles were counselled to lighten their garments, to eat cooling foods, and to cleanse only by changing linen more often, or by applying fragrant cloths dipped in vinegar to the face and hands. Lent, with its fasts and solemnities, reinforced restraint, reminding the faithful that indulgence in comfort, even the comfort of bathing, was a temptation. To endure without water was a form of piety, aligning the noble's body with the season's austerity. Summer, with its heavy heat, made the thought of water alluring, yet it was feared most of all. Physicians claimed that the pores lay wide open in the summer sun, the body vulnerable to the corruption that drifted in the air. To immerse oneself, then, was to invite illness through every breath and pore. Instead, nobles turned to perfumes and powders, to herbs scattered across floors and hung in chambers, believing these could cool and protect. The church calendar too warned of excess, for summer was filled with feast days and processions, moments when the body was displayed in its finery before the community. Linen was changed frequently, not for cleanliness, but for appearance, ensuring that the noble seemed refreshed even in the oppressive heat. Autumn, season of harvest, was bound to melancholy and black bile. It was believed that the body grew heavier, slower, more prone to sadness in this time, and physicians cautioned against anything that might disturb the fragile balance. Bathing, which stirred the humours, was discouraged, lest it plunge the noble into deeper melancholy or illness. Instead, diets were adjusted to lighten the spirit. Fruits, wines, and spiced dishes offered warmth and stimulation. The great feasts of autumn, tied to harvest, and to the approach of All Saints and All Souls' days, placed more emphasis on the ritual of washing hands before and after meals than on any thought of immersion. To wash one's hands publicly was to show both respect for the feast and acknowledgement of spiritual cleanliness. Winter, harshest of all, was when bathing all but ceased. The cold itself was viewed as an enemy, and to expose the body to water, then to the biting air, was thought to invite certain death. Even washing the face was minimized, for the chill could strike the pores and settle illness deep within. Instead, nobles wrapped themselves in layers of wool and fur, relying on warmth as their shield. Their chambers were shuttered, rushes on the floors renewed with pungent herbs to counter the heavy air. The church marked this season with Advent and Christmas, times of solemnity and joy, but neither offered reason to immerse in water. Instead, cleanliness came in ritual. The donning of fresh linen for Mass, the anointing of skin with fragrant oils before gatherings, the fumigation of halls with incense at Christmastide. Thus, the noble's body was cleansed not by daily baths, but by alignment with the turning year. Just as crops were sown and harvested in their proper seasons, so too was the body managed according to time. To immerse outside these rhythms was reckless. To ignore the warnings of both physician and priest was to tempt fate. Instead, water touched the noble only rarely, often tied to sacred occasions, before marriage, before certain feasts, or in preparation for burial. In this way, washing became bound to worship, each act less about hygiene than about symbolism, marking moments of passage in the life of the soul. To modern eyes, such habits seem strange, even harsh, but to the medieval noble, they were woven naturally into the fabric of existence. Life was lived in harmony with cycles greater than the self, and cleanliness was no exception. The seasons dictated safety, the church guided ritual, and between them the noble body was preserved, sheltered from water by the steady march of time and faith. The deadly chill of cold water. Among all the fears that haunted the noble mind, none seemed more immediate, more insidious than the chill. To us, cold may seem a simple discomfort, a thing to be endured until warmth returns, but in the Middle Ages, to catch a chill was to risk one's life, and the chill most feared of all was that which followed water. The idea that pores opened to draw in sickness was more than theory, it was conviction, reinforced by generations of sorrow, when fevers rose after a cooling draught, when coughs turned to death in the space of days. For nobles, wrapped in layers of fabric and scented protections, water was not cleansing but betrayal. It stripped away the body's defenses, left it vulnerable to the cold that lingered in every corridor, every night breeze. Physicians warned in solemn tones that a body warmed by immersion was a body undone. The heat of the bath opened every pore, released the vital vapors, and left the flesh as porous as cloth. When the bather emerged, even the gentlest draught could slip through these openings and take root within. The result, they said, was sudden fever, or pleurisy, or death itself. It mattered little that modern eyes might see coincidence where they saw cause. In their world, where each breath carried risk, such explanations became law. Nobles, who feared illness more than the common folk for their lives, were heavier with responsibility. Their deaths more disastrous clung fiercely to this belief. Chroniclers told of kings struck down after imprudent exposure. Tales spread of courtiers who, seeking relief in a cool stream during summer's heat, fell ill within days and perished. Such stories were repeated as warnings, shaping custom into iron rule. Better, it was said, to endure the weight of sweat and odor than to risk the fatal chill. Physicians prescribed thick blankets immediately after any rare bath. Attendants standing ready to swaddle their lord or lady the instant water was left behind. Hot spiced wines were offered at once, meant to restore warmth and close the body's pores before danger could creep in. Bathing chambers were sealed tightly, fires blazing to drive away draughts. Yet even with these precautions, nobles trembled at the thought of what might follow. The chill did not lurk only in baths. It prowled in corridors where wind slipped through gaps in stone, in chambers where dampness clung to walls, in beds when covers were thrown back too hastily. To be struck by cold at such moments was thought as dangerous as poison. And so, nobles dressed themselves in fortresses of cloth, keeping their bodies always wrapped. They slept in layers, children swaddled tightly as though to shield them from invisible claws. Servants hurried to keep fires lit, to close shutters against the night, to guard their masters from even the whisper of a draught. Fear of the chill governed not only bathing but the entire conduct of daily life. Even water for drinking was treated with suspicion. Cold water, taken straight from the well, was deemed dangerous to the stomach, able to shock the inner organs as surely as a draught struck the skin. Better to drink wine, warmed with spices, than to trust to water's treachery. Physicians advised adding honey, herbs, or ale to water, believing such mixtures tamed its coldness and lessened its threat. A cup of pure cold water was a rarity among nobles, reserved perhaps for times of illness when the body burned too hot, and then given, reluctantly, in measured sips. The poor, who could not afford such caution, bathed in rivers, drank from streams, and endured chills as part of life. But nobles watched them with a mixture of disdain and dread, certain that these reckless habits explained their frequent sickness and short lives. To the noble, prudence lay in avoidance, in keeping the body wrapped and guarded, in shunning cold water as one shunned pestilence. And so, class distinction again revealed itself. The poor lived amid water, the noble apart from it, each convinced that their way was necessity. It is easy to imagine, then, why the very thought of cold water became a spectre in noble households. It was not refreshing but deadly, not a relief but a threat. Servants whispered of it when recounting tales of sudden death. Physicians invoked it when prescribing caution. Parents warned their children never to stand too near an open window, never to linger by a cold fountain, never to expose their warm bodies to the kiss of air after washing. The chill was everywhere, unseen, unpredictable, and always ready to strike. Thus, the aversion to bathing deepened into certainty. To step into water was not simply to risk imbalance of humours, nor merely to court sin, but to invite the very thing most dreaded, the cold that crept silently into the body and claimed it. And so nobles preferred to remain dry, to trust to linen, perfume, and ritual, rather than open themselves to the treachery of water and the deadly chill that followed in its wake. Powders, oils, and masks of skin. In the long shadow of water's suspicion, nobles turned to other means of fashioning their bodies into acceptable forms of purity and beauty. Since immersion was dangerous, appearance had to be maintained by artifice, and so powders, oils, and cosmetics became the masks behind which the noble face was hidden. To walk into a medieval court was to enter a theatre of scents and colours, where skin was rarely bare and natural, but layered in subtle disguises, each meant to conceal what water could not wash away. The face, exposed most often to scrutiny, demanded the greatest care. Women of high birth dusted their cheeks with white powders, often ground from rice or lead, to suggest pallor and refinement. A pale complexion was the mark of leisure, proof that one did not labour beneath the sun like peasants in the fields. Yet beneath the surface of elegance lay the harsh truth. The powders often poisoned the skin, leaving sores that required yet more layers of cover. But this was tolerated, even expected, for to appear untouched by toil or blemish was more important than to preserve the natural health of flesh. Rouge was added sparingly to lips or cheeks, not to imitate the bloom of life, but to heighten contrast against the whiteness, like a rose pressed between pages of a book. For men, too, cosmetics played a part. Nobles anointed their hair and beards with fragrant oils, combing them into neatness, allowing perfume to cling to every strand. A courtier might carry in his beard the musk of civet or the sharp freshness of rosemary, turning each breath into an act of display. Skin was smoothed with ointments of almond or olive oil, sometimes mixed with herbs to counter the dryness of winter air or the roughness of age. To be noble was to be scented, polished, prepared a living icon of refinement, even if beneath the sheen lay months of unwashed reality. Wigs and hairpieces added another layer to this artifice. In times when illness or poor hygiene caused hair to thin, nobles commissioned elaborate wigs, powdered or perfumed, to crown their heads with dignity. These were not simply adornments but barriers, shields against both ridicule and odour. A perfumed wig, carefully tended, could mask the less pleasant truths of the scalp beneath, and in crowded courts, where proximity could not always be avoided, such artifices became necessities. The rustle of powdered hair, the faint cloud of fragrance that accompanied a bow or curtsy, all were part of the noble performance of cleanliness. Clothing, too, was enlisted in this masquerade. Scented sachets were sewn into seams, powders sprinkled into gloves and shoes, so that every movement released the suggestion of freshness. Even the act of greeting was transformed by these artifices. A handshake meant inhaling the perfume of a glove. A bow drew one into the scented folds of a gown. Thus, contact itself became controlled, the natural odor of the human body replaced by layers of chosen fragrances and powders. There was artistry in these practices, but also superstition. Physicians encouraged the use of oils and powders as protection, believing that strong scents warded off disease, sealing the skin against corruption. A noble lady might dab her temples with vinegar infused with rose petals, convinced it would protect her from fevers. A lord might rub his chest with camphor, believing it strengthened the heart. These acts blurred the line between medicine and vanity, becoming rituals as much about safety as about beauty. In the privacy of chambers, the process of preparing these masks was both intimate and laborious. Servants ground powders, distilled oils, prepared pastes of herbs and fats. Mirrors, rare and costly, reflected the transformed face, assuring the noble that the mask was secure. The natural body was hidden, reshaped by the hand of art, until only the image of refinement remained. Yet beneath the powders and oils, the skin was often raw, irritated, or weary. In this way, the pursuit of cleanliness without water created its own burdens, its own slow damage, hidden beneath the veneer of beauty. Still, to appear unadorned was unthinkable. Nobles judged one another harshly by sight and scent, and to neglect these artifices was to risk disgrace. A woman whose face bore blemishes without powder, a man whose beard smelled of sweat rather than oil, became objects of scorn, whispered about in corridors, mocked in songs. Thus, the mask was not optional but required, as essential to nobility as sword or crown. In a world where bathing was rare, appearance was everything, and appearance could be maintained only by disguise. So the court glittered with faces powdered pale, lips rouged faintly, hair perfumed, garments heavy with sachets. To the modern eye, it may seem a masquerade, a dance of falseness, but to the medieval noble, it was survival, the art of appearing clean and whole in a world that mistrusted water. Powders, oils, and masks of skin became their chosen shield, their fragrant armor against both disease and dishonor, and so they lived beneath these layers, never truly bare, never wholly themselves. Hand-washing before the feast. When nobles gathered for a banquet, where tables groaned beneath roasted meats, trenchers of bread, and silver goblets brimming with wine, one ritual was as essential as the feast itself, the washing of hands. In a world where full immersion in water was rare and feared, this act stood apart, an accepted and even celebrated gesture of cleanliness, woven deeply into both etiquette and symbolism. The hand-washing that preceded dining was not simply a matter of hygiene, but of honor, of piety, and of social order. To cleanse one's hands before touching food was to declare oneself ready, not only to eat, but to partake in the dignity of noble life. The ritual began with the arrival of basins. Servants entered the hall bearing vessels of gleaming metal, often silver or brass, filled with warm water, scented with herbs or rose petals. Behind them came others with towels of linen, carefully folded and held out with reverence. Guests, seated according to rank, waited their turn as the basins were carried from place to place. A servant poured the perfumed water over a lord's hands, the liquid glistening in candlelight as it fell into the basin. The noble rubbed his palms together, lifted them briefly, as if in prayer, then dried them on the linen offered. A lady might extend her fingers gracefully, the water slipping between jeweled rings, the gesture as much display as purification. The scent lingered as the basin moved on, weaving fragrance through the hall. This washing was both practical and symbolic. To eat with one's fingers, as was customary, required clean hands, or at least the appearance of them, but the act also carried deeper meaning. Water here was not feared, for it touched only the extremities, not the pores of the body. It refreshed without endangering, and so was embraced as a safe ritual. Priests blessed such gestures, comparing them to spiritual purification before communion. The noble who washed his hands before a meal declared himself orderly, virtuous, and ready to join in the communal act of feasting. To neglect this ritual was unthinkable, for it suggested not only filth but disrespect for host, company, and God. The ceremony of hand-washing did not end with the meal's beginning. Between courses, servants sometimes returned with basins, offering guests a chance to refresh again. At the close of the feast, when the air was heavy with the scent of meat and wine, hands were once more washed and dried, sending diners home with a lingering sense of cleanliness and renewal. These repeated gestures reinforced the belief that while the body itself might not be bathed, the parts most visible and active in society, the hands must be purified continually. Beyond its function, the ritual reinforced rank. The order in which guests received the basin revealed their standing in the host's esteem. To be offered water early was an honor, to be passed over or delayed a humiliation. Servants themselves were judged by the elegance of their performance, the steadiness with which they poured, the fineness of the linen they offered. In this way, hand-washing became a dance of hierarchy, each motion weighted with meaning, each drop of scented water a sign of the intricate web of noble society. The symbolism extended even further. Chronicles describe kings and queens washing hands publicly before addressing their courts, as if to cleanse themselves not only for food but for the weight of speech and judgment. In some places, scented water was offered before Mass, the congregation washing, as if preparing for communion with God. Thus, hand-washing carried both worldly and sacred weight, a small ritual echoing the great themes of purity, order, and devotion that ruled the medieval mind. And so, though nobles feared to immerse their bodies, they embraced the basin at table, finding in this limited contact with water a safe and meaningful compromise. The ritual soothed anxieties, masked odors with fragrance, and bound the feast in a frame of order. It was, in its own way, a miniature of the age, a gesture of cleanliness without true bathing, a reliance on ritual over reality, a blending of fear and faith into a custom that endured for centuries. Thus, when the noble lifted a morsel of meat from the trencher, he did so with hands that bore the scent of rosemary or rosewater, hands that had been purified by ceremony, if not by soap. And when the feast ended, and laughter echoed through the halls, guests departed with fingers refreshed, convinced that they had partaken not only of food but of order, piety, and grace. The ritual of hand-washing stood as one of the few moments when water was welcomed into noble life, not as danger, but as a symbol of dignity. The Church and the temptation of water. In the heart of the Middle Ages, the Church shaped every corner of life, and so it shaped also the noble body and its habits of cleanliness. Baptism itself sanctified water, marking it as holy when used in ritual. Yet outside of that narrow frame, water became suspect, even sinful, a substance that tempted the flesh more than it cleansed the soul. Within monasteries, abbots and abbesses debated the place of bathing, some seeing in it a modest care of the body, others condemning it as indulgence and vanity. And for nobles, whose conduct was judged always under the watchful eyes of the Church, these teachings became the foundation of how they approached the element most feared and most needed. In sermons, priests often warned that to pamper the body was to neglect the soul. Bathing, they said, was a luxury of the idle, a gateway to pride and lust. The act of stripping bare, of lingering in warm water, was painted as an invitation to temptation. Flesh softened by the bath was flesh that longed for further indulgence, and so the clergy urged restraint. Better to endure the burden of odor, better to live within the fortress of linen and perfume, than to risk the corruption that might follow from indulgence in water. Sin was believed to creep easily into comfort, and the bath was comfort distilled. Yet contradictions abounded, for the same Church that condemned indulgence also encouraged cleanliness in certain places. Some monasteries built bathhouses, allowing monks to bathe on set days, usually for health rather than pleasure. Hospitals maintained by religious orders sometimes included baths for the sick, water heated and infused with herbs to soothe the body. Pilgrims arriving at shrines were sometimes offered washing of hands or feet, echoing Christ's own act of humility at the Last Supper. These practices suggested that water, used sparingly and in the right spirit, could be sanctified rather than sinful. But for the nobility, the Church's ambivalence fostered caution more than liberty. Few dared to bathe often when priests thundered warnings from the pulpit. Fewer still risked scandal by visiting public bathhouses, long condemned as dens of vice. Even in private chambers, the act of immersion was undertaken with unease, followed by prayers and blessings to counter the peril. The Church had tied bathing not only to bodily danger, but to moral danger, making every encounter with water a spiritual trial. Confessionals bore witness to this anxiety. Nobles admitted to enjoying warm baths, to delighting in the feel of scented waters, and priests admonished them to repent, lest such indulgence lead them astray. Manuals of penance sometimes listed bathing among minor sins of luxury, placing it alongside gambling or excessive feasting. For a devout noble, such warnings weighed heavily, reinforcing the belief that restraint was the path of virtue. To remain unwashed became, paradoxically, a sign of piety, an offering of discomfort to God in exchange for salvation. At the same time, the Church made symbolic use of water in ways that deepened fear of its ordinary presence. Holy water, sprinkled upon the faithful, was a sacrament, a weapon against demons. But precisely because holy water was needed, ordinary water seemed more profane, more dangerous. The more the Church exalted water when blessed, the more suspicious, unblessed water appeared. It was not a neutral substance, but one divided sharply between sacred and perilous, depending on who wielded it and for what purpose. Thus nobles lived within this paradox. They bowed their heads as priests sprinkled them with holy water, believing themselves protected, even cleansed of sin. They shuddered at the thought of entering unblessed water, fearing sickness and temptation. They watched monks in some regions bathe under strict rules and wondered whether such liberties might be safe for them as well, yet dared not defy the harsher voices that cried out against it. The Church did not outlaw bathing outright, but its stern reminders shaped noble conscience until abstinence became the safer path. And so the noble body, always watched, always judged, remained wrapped in linen and fragrance, its rare encounters with water bound to ritual and necessity. When nobles bathed, it was not for indulgence but for solemnity, as when preparing for marriage, childbirth, or burial. These were thresholds of life, moments when water's touch could be justified as holy. At all other times, water was temptation, best resisted. The Church had made of it a mirror of the soul, sanctified in sacrament, suspect in pleasure. Thus, as bells tolled across the towns and plains of Christendom, summoning nobles to prayer and penance, the bath remained both near and far, both forbidden and necessary. Water was no longer simply an element. It was a moral question, a battlefield where body and soul contended. And in that struggle, avoidance became virtue, fragrance became piety, and the fear of sin entwined with the fear of sickness, binding the noble body more tightly than ever within its fortress of cloth and ritual. Strangers who stared in disbelief. To see the habits of European nobles through their own eyes was to see prudence, caution, and virtue. Yet when strangers from foreign lands arrived, bearing customs of their own, what they saw was bewilderment. Travellers from the East, accustomed to the steam baths of Constantinople or the perfumed hammams of Cairo, stepped into the courts of Europe and found lords and ladies wrapped in brocade, heavy with oils and powders, but curiously untouched by water. They wrote of their astonishment, their pens dripping with disbelief and sometimes scorn, for to them the noble fear of bathing seemed both strange and pitiable. Arab chroniclers, who came with merchants along Mediterranean routes, often described Europeans as unclean despite their wealth. In the Islamic world, ritual washing was an act of faith, performed before prayer, embedded deeply in daily rhythm. To avoid water was to defy not only nature but God's law. And so, when these travellers observed Christian nobles anointing themselves with perfumes instead of washing, they noted the contradiction. How could a man cloaked in silks, with rings glittering on his fingers, recoil from the very water that ran beside his castle walls. To them, the noble who feared bathing was like a warrior who feared the sword, an inversion of the natural order. Byzantine observers, heirs to Roman traditions of public baths, likewise looked westward with dismay. In Constantinople, great bathhouses still stood, their domes echoing with steam and voices, marble floors polished by generations of feet. To bathe was to honor the body, to refresh the spirit, to partake in the continuity of civilization. When Byzantine envoys visited Western courts, they carried with them the memory of these gleaming baths, and the absence of similar customs in Europe seemed a mark of decline. Chronicles sometimes describe them, remarking on the heavy perfumes of noble courts, the incense burning in halls, the sachets hidden in garments, all poor substitutes, in their eyes, for the cleansing power of water. Even within Europe itself, travellers between regions noticed differences. In the south, closer to the Mediterranean, where echoes of Roman and Arab practices lingered, bathing was more frequent. Cities like Valencia or Palermo maintained traditions of heated baths, and nobles there sometimes indulged in them with greater ease. Northern visitors, raised in cultures more suspicious of water, remarked upon these habits with both envy and caution, fearing that such liberties might court illness. Thus, even within Christendom, the act of bathing became a point of cultural contrast, marking north from south, east from west. The astonishment of foreigners was not only about bathing, but about the odours that clung to noble life. To a traveller from Cairo, whose streets were scented with jasmine and whose baths flowed with rosewater, the air of a medieval European court seemed heavy, even oppressive. Perfumes could not fully mask the mingling smells of unwashed bodies, smoke-filled halls, and rushes long strewn upon floors. Accounts sometimes remark on the strength of these odours, describing them as overwhelming, yet accepted without comment by those who lived within them. To the outsider, the contradiction was stark. Wealth beyond measure, jewels and silks, and yet an atmosphere that seemed primitive, untouched by the simplest act of washing. And yet, there was also fascination. Foreign visitors often described European nobles as fierce, hardy, even barbarous in their endurance. To live without bathing, to wear heavy garments for weeks, to carry one's body into battle and counsel alike without fear of filth, seemed both incomprehensible and impressive. It marked the Europeans, in the eyes of others, as a people forged by hardship, defined more by austerity than indulgence. This impression, though tinged with disdain, also carried respect. The refusal to bathe became, paradoxically, a sign of strength, a harsh discipline of body that foreigners both mocked and marvelled at. In letters and chronicles, the disbelief of outsiders was recorded with vivid detail. They spoke of kings who avoided baths yet drenched themselves in ambergris, of queens who carried pomanders instead of washing, of lords who feared cold water more than the sword. These accounts, spread along trade routes and among scholars, shaped the image of Europe abroad as a land both rich and strange, powerful in arms, but curiously frail in its care of the body. And within Europe, such writings sometimes returned as quiet provocations, reminding nobles that beyond their borders, others lived differently, more freely with water. Yet habit and fear are stronger than curiosity. Even as tales of foreign baths reached their ears, most nobles held fast to their ways. What others saw as filth, they saw as prudence. What others mocked as backward, they praised as virtue. Still, the disbelief of strangers lingered, like a mirror held up to their customs, showing how peculiar they appeared to the wider world. And in that mirror lay the first seeds of change, for no society remains untouched by the gaze of outsiders forever. But in the heart of the Middle Ages, the noble still clung to linen and perfume, while travellers shook their heads in wonder, baffled at a world where water was feared as much as plague. Secret soakings in hidden rooms. Though the noble world declared water dangerous, though physicians and priests warned against its touch, there were always those who could not resist its allure. Behind closed doors, away from the gaze of confessors and courtiers, some nobles sought the forbidden comfort of the bath. These were not the public bathhouses scorned as dens of vice, but private chambers hidden within castles and manor houses, small spaces where tubs were filled in secret where steam curled into rafters and whispers of indulgence lingered like incense. In such hidden rooms, the noble body met water more often than records admit, though always with caution and always beneath a veil of secrecy. Diaries and household accounts sometimes betray these moments. A countess, weary from summer's heat, noted the relief of slipping into a tub filled with rosewater and herbs, though she confessed her fear that illness might follow. A duke, recovering from fever, recorded his physician's advice to take a tepid bath, though he insisted the room be sealed against draughts and the servants sworn to silence. These fragments, scattered through history, reveal what official customs concealed, that bathing, while feared, was also desired, and that nobles, like all humans, longed for the refreshment of water upon skin. The baths themselves were carefully prepared, more like ceremonies than acts of hygiene. Wooden tubs were lined with cloth, filled with water heated in cauldrons, and perfumed with herbs meant to guard against corruption. Servants brought in heated stones to maintain warmth, laid rushes and carpets upon the floors to prevent draughts, and burned incense to sweeten the air. Once the noble entered, attendants hovered nearby with blankets, ready to wrap the body the instant it emerged. Wine or spiced ale was offered at once, to restore heat within. Every precaution was taken to transform what might have been indulgence into something that could be justified as medicine. Yet secrecy remained paramount. Few nobles admitted openly to bathing more than once a year. To confess, it was to risk censure, to be judged vain or reckless. Thus, the practice became hidden, spoken of only in whispers, written rarely, remembered in shadows. Even when bathing was prescribed by physicians, it was cloaked in the language of necessity, never pleasure. A noblewoman who soaked in a tub of chamomile might call it a treatment for melancholy. A nobleman who bathed after a hunt might claim it was to soothe strained muscles. Always, the act was masked by the veil of remedy, never indulgence. But within those hidden rooms, the truth was simpler. Water felt good. It eased the body, lifted the weight of sweat and dust, and offered a rare sense of renewal. For a few brief moments, nobles could forget their fortress of cloth, their constant perfumes, their fear of invisible dangers, and simply feel the body cleansed. Perhaps they lingered longer than was wise. Perhaps they emerged with both relief and guilt, but the memory of that comfort remained. It is no wonder, then, that despite all prohibitions, some returned again and again to their secret baths, weaving them into their lives like hidden prayers. Servants, of course, knew these secrets. They carried the water, heated the cauldrons, prepared the herbs. They saw their lords and ladies stripped of finery, bare in ways the court never imagined. And yet they spoke little, for silence was demanded, and loyalty required. A servant who betrayed such knowledge risked dismissal, even punishment, so the hidden baths remained hidden, preserved by the complicity of those who tended them, their memory surviving only in rare mentions that slipped through the careful silence of noble households. The irony was profound. Nobles feared water in public, avoided it in ritual, condemned it in bathhouses, yet sought it privately when weariness or desire grew too strong. This duality marked their age, a constant tension between belief and longing, fear and need. And so the noble body lived in contradiction, perfumed and powdered before the world, but at times secretly immersed, warmed by scented water in chambers where no priest or chronicler could see. In these hidden soaks, one glimpses the humanity of the Middle Ages most clearly. Beneath layers of custom and fear, the desire for comfort endured. Even when the church thundered against indulgence, even when physicians warned of humours disturbed, even when the memory of plague lingered in every breath, the noble still sought moments of relief. And though history remembers their perfumes, their powders, their fortress of linen, somewhere behind stone walls water still flowed, filling hidden tubs, offering forbidden solace to those who dared. Children fragile as glass. If the noble adult feared the touch of water, then how much greater was the fear when it came to children? To raise an heir in the Middle Ages was to guard a treasure more fragile than crystal. For every cough, every fever, every restless night seemed a shadow of death. Infant mortality was high, even among the wealthiest, and nobles who had buried children in tiny coffins knew all too well how fleeting life could be. Thus, Bathing a child became not an ordinary act of care but a perilous gamble, a ritual performed with trembling hands, heavy with caution, and haunted by the belief that the smallest mistake could open the door to sickness. Newborns were swaddled tightly from the moment of birth, their tiny bodies bound in layers of linen to keep them straight and warm, to shield them from draughts that might strike their unformed humours. Washing was kept to a minimum. The midwife might wipe the child with warmed cloths, dipped lightly in scented waters, but full immersion was rare. Physicians warned that infant skin was tender, their pores wide open, their humours unsettled. A bath might cool them too quickly, or let foul airs seep into their fragile frames. Better, it was said, to keep them wrapped and dry, to change their linen often, and to protect them with amulets and herbs. As children grew, the fear did not lessen. A prince or princess was the embodiment of a dynasty's future, and to risk their health with water seemed folly. Chronicles tell of noble mothers instructing nurses never to expose their charges to cold baths, never to leave them uncovered after washing, never to allow the night air to touch their damp skin. If a bath was ordered, it was prepared with extraordinary care. The chamber heated, the water perfumed with chamomile or rose, the time kept brief, the child wrapped instantly in warm cloths. Even then, mothers watched anxiously, as though death itself hovered at the door. The church added its voice, shaping how noble children encountered water. Baptism was the only immersion sanctified without question, a ritual that washed away sin and secured the soul. But beyond that moment, water was to be handled with restraint. Clerics urged parents to avoid pampering children with luxuries, and warm baths were seen as a softness that might weaken both body and spirit. To raise a child strong was to raise them hardy, clothed against draughts, shielded from indulgence, trained to endure without the comforts of water. Yet there were contradictions. Some physicians prescribed gentle baths for sickly children, believing that certain herbs could calm fevers or soothe rashes. A bath of warm milk, for instance, was sometimes recommended for delicate skin, though it was more symbol of wealth than true remedy. Rosewater, believed to strengthen the heart, might be dabbed upon an infant's temples, but these treatments were rare, exceptions to a rule of avoidance. More often, linen was seen as safer than water, and mothers entrusted laundresses to keep their children clean through frequent changes of clothing rather than through bathing. In nurseries, the air was heavy with herbs hung from beams, sachets tucked into cradles, charms tied around small wrists. Lavender, sage, and angelica were thought to ward off illness, guarding the child from the miasmas that threatened through every breath. Perfumed oils were rubbed into skin to protect against chill. Nurses rocked swaddled infants beside fires, whispering prayers as they tended them, their care less about water than about warmth, ritual, and constant vigilance. Childhood itself was seen as a fragile state, a narrow bridge between birth and survival, where even the slightest misstep, a draught, a dampness, a bath might shatter life like glass. Thus, noble children grew up with water as a stranger. Their earliest memories were not of baths, but of linen, of scented cloths pressed to their skin, of oils brushed into their hair. They learned from infancy that to be noble was to be wrapped, protected, preserved, rather than exposed. The fear of water was taught as naturally as the lessons of prayer or etiquette, passed from parent to child as part of the wisdom of survival. And so the fragile air, carried in arms through cold corridors and smoky halls, lived encased in cloth and care, a living vessel of family fortune, too precious ever to be risked in the dangerous embrace of water. The scents of gardens and chambers. If water was feared, and linen exalted, then fragrance was the invisible thread that bound noble life together. It drifted through chambers, clung to garments, rose from gardens, and lingered in the very air nobles breathed. For in a world where unwashed bodies and smoke-filled halls were inescapable, scent was both shield and solace, a companion against the stench of mortality. The noble's garden was not only for beauty but for defence, and the chamber not merely for rest but for ritual of smell. Step into the garden of a medieval manor, and you find not wild blooms but carefully tended beds of herbs and flowers, chosen as much for their properties as for their colour. Roses were cultivated for their fragrance, their petals dried and stored in linen bags to perfume chambers through winter. Lavender grew in rows, harvested and tied into bundles to hang from rafters, its sharp sweetness believed to drive away pestilence. Sage, thyme, marjoram, and rosemary filled the air, their scents rising with every brush of hand or hem, their presence thought to cleanse the very breath of those who walked among them. The garden was a fortress of fragrance, built to arm the noble household against invisible threats. Inside the chambers, the war against odour continued. Floors were strewn with rushes, renewed with each season, and into these were scattered petals and herbs, so that each step released a faint perfume. Cushions were stuffed with dried flowers, beds lined with sachets of rose, chamomile, or violet. Smoke from braziers carried the scent of juniper or frankincense, filling the air with curls of sweetness that masked the heaviness of unwashed bodies and closed rooms. Even closets and chests were packed with herbs, so that garments carried with them the breath of gardens, the memory of summer fields preserved in winter's gloom. These scents were not mere luxuries, they were believed to hold real power. Physicians and priests alike declared that sweet odours purified the air, warding off the miasmas that carried disease. To walk into a perfumed chamber was to step into safety, to feel guarded against unseen dangers. A noble might sleep more soundly knowing lavender hung above the bed, or carry a sachet of rosemary close to the heart as protection against plague. The very act of breathing was transformed into ritual, each inhalation a defense, each fragrance a talisman. Nor were these practices confined to the private sphere. Public display of fragrance became a mark of status, a sign that one lived not in squalor, but in cultivated safety. Banquet halls were fumigated with herbs before guests arrived, creating an atmosphere heavy with spice and smoke. Gardens were displayed proudly, their ordered rows of roses and herbs reflecting the wealth and prudence of the household. Even in processions, nobles carried pomanders or wore scented gloves, ensuring that their presence was marked by fragrance as much as by finery. The noble did not merely appear clean, he or she exhaled cleanliness, projecting it like a second skin. But fragrance also carried intimacy. Lovers exchanged sachets filled with dried petals, small tokens that released scent whenever touched, binding memory and affection together. Letters were sealed with wax and brushed with rosewater, so that words arrived bearing the breath of flowers. Mothers tucked herbs into the beds of their children, believing their fragrance would protect them through the night. In these gestures, scent was not only armor, but tenderness, weaving itself into the daily bonds of noble life. Yet for all its beauty, the world of fragrance was a world of labor. Servants tended the gardens, gathered herbs at the right season, dried them carefully, stored them in chests. They swept rushes and replaced them, fumigated rooms with smoking herbs, prepared oils and waters by distillation. The noble breathed sweetness, but behind it lay hours of unseen toil, the quiet work of hands that kept chambers fragrant against the tide of odor. Thus, gardens and chambers became sanctuaries, not of water, but of air. In their scents, nobles found both comfort and defense, believing themselves guarded from disease and elevated above the squalor that pressed in from the streets outside. The fragrance of lavender on a pillow, of rose petals in a basin, of rosemary burning in a brazier, these were the noble's true bath, the cleansing of the senses without the peril of immersion. To live among such scents was to live apart, protected, preserved, perfumed against a world that reeked of death and decay. The Renaissance breathes new air. As the late Middle Ages gave way to the dawning light of the Renaissance, the noble world began, cautiously, to shift. For centuries, water had been feared as a thief of health, a vessel of sin, a gateway for disease. Yet, as Europe reached outward through trade, through conquest, through curiosity, new ideas seeped in like dawn breaking through shutters. The Renaissance, with its hunger for classical knowledge and its fascination with the human form, breathed new air into the stagnant chambers of medieval thought. And with this air came a softening, a hesitant reimagining of water and its place in noble life. The rediscovery of ancient texts played its part. Scholars, translating works of Hippocrates and Galen anew, began to question medieval interpretations of the humours. The Roman world, so admired for its architecture and philosophy, had also bathed openly, gloriously, in its great thermae. Marble baths, once ruins crumbling in silence, became objects of fascination for humanists who saw in them not sin but civilization. To emulate Rome was to reclaim a grandeur long lost, and whispers spread in noble courts that perhaps bathing, done wisely, might not be the folly once believed. Contact with the East deepened this shift. Crusaders, merchants and envoys returned with stories of Turkish hammams and Arab baths, places where steam and fragrance mingled, where the body was renewed in ritual cleansing. To European ears, these tales carried both wonder and envy. Some nobles, emboldened by curiosity, began to experiment with their own baths, often in private, building chambers that mimicked what they had seen abroad. Water, infused with herbs or heated to gentle steam, became less a threat and more a possibility, though still wrapped in caution. Physicians, too, began to adjust their prescriptions, suggesting that bathing in moderation might restore balance rather than disturb it. Art and philosophy joined the transformation. Renaissance painters celebrated the nude, not as shameful, but as beautiful, the body itself a reflection of divine order. In such images, the human form was no longer a fragile vessel to be swaddled and hidden, but a creation to be admired and even exposed. This cultural shift nudged nobles toward a different view of their own flesh, one less defined by fear. To cleanse the body was to honor its form, not to endanger it. To step into water was, slowly, to reconnect with a sense of harmony between body and world. Yet the change did not sweep away old fears overnight. Many nobles clung to perfumes and linen, to powders and sachets, unwilling to abandon habits bound so tightly to faith and tradition. The church, too, remained ambivalent. Some clergy embraced the new humanism, seeing in it a chance to celebrate God's creation. Others condemned it as vanity and pride. In this tension, noble households divided. Some experimented with small private baths, others held firm to the fortress of fragrance. The Renaissance was not a single moment but a long breath, a slow unbinding of customs that had held for centuries. Still, the direction was clear. In Italian courts, noble families built bathhouses adorned with frescoes, where guests were invited to soak in warm pools before feasts. In France, perfumes remained, but bathing began to return as a supplement rather than a replacement. Even in northern lands, where chill and suspicion lingered longest, voices arose suggesting that moderation in bathing might strengthen rather than weaken the body. The noble world stood on the threshold of transformation, poised between the medieval fear of water and the modern embrace of it. This gradual shift marked more than hygiene. It was a sign of a new confidence in the human body and in reason itself. Where once nobles had trusted only in ritual and tradition, they now looked to learning, to observation, to rediscovered wisdom. The Renaissance taught them to see water not as enemy but as element, capable of danger, yes, but also of healing and renewal. And so, chamber by chamber, estate by estate, the noble body began to return to the bath, cautiously at first, but with growing assurance, as though a door long closed had been unlocked. Thus, the Renaissance breathed new air into the noble world, carrying with it the scent of roses and herbs, but also the faint freshness of water itself. The fortress of linen and perfume did not vanish, but it opened small windows, allowing in breezes that promised a new way of living. And though the medieval fear still lingered, like a shadow at the edge of candlelight, the dawn of a new age had begun, in which water would slowly regain its place, not as temptation or peril, but as friend. The ghost of a legend. When the Middle Ages faded into memory and the Renaissance reshaped Europe, the old fears of water began, slowly, to dissolve. Yet the habits of centuries leave long shadows, and the image of the medieval noble, perfumed and powdered, yet untouched by water, never truly disappeared. Instead, it lingered in chronicles and anecdotes, repeated by later generations with a mixture of horror and fascination, until it hardened into legend that nobles of the Middle Ages bathed but once a year, and some, it was whispered, even less. This legend, whether wholly true or embellished, became a mirror in which later centuries looked back upon the medieval world. In the Enlightenment, thinkers mocked the superstition of their forebears, contrasting their own embrace of reason and cleanliness with the supposed filth of the past. Writers describe nobles who feared a draught more than a blade, who cloaked themselves in fragrance while disease crept unchecked. The story of Queen Isabella, who claimed to have bathed only twice in her life, the tale of Louis XIV drenched in perfume but never in water. These were told and retold, not merely as history but as moral lessons, symbols of ignorance conquered by progress. Yet like many legends, the truth is more complex. Some nobles bathed more than once a year, though quietly, in private chambers hidden from scrutiny. Others truly did avoid water, clinging to the fortress of linen and perfume. What mattered is not the exact number of baths, but the belief that bathing was perilous, that water opened the body to corruption, and that fragrance, ritual, and restraint were safer paths. That belief, whether practiced rigidly or flexibly, defined an age, and it left behind the enduring impression of a world that mistrusted what we now consider essential. And so the legend has lived on, shaping how we imagine the Middle Ages. When modern minds conjure images of knights and castles, they often also picture halls heavy with odour, nobles drenched in musk, and children swaddled endlessly against draughts. The idea of one bath a year has become shorthand for an entire world view, one in which water was not friend but foe, in which cleanliness was a matter of cloth and fragrance rather than soap and water. It is a caricature, perhaps, but one rooted in the truths of fear, ritual, and custom that governed noble life. The persistence of this legend also reveals something deeper, the fascination with what is strange, with habits so alien to our own that they seem almost unimaginable. To us, who bathe daily, who treat water as ordinary, the idea of fearing it seems at once absurd and intriguing. But in that absurdity lies a reminder that every age sees itself as rational, every custom as natural, and yet time transforms certainty into curiosity, practice into legend. What was once prudence has become, in memory, peculiarity. Thus, the noble world of the Middle Ages survives not only in its cathedrals and chronicles, but in the ghost of this legend. A world of fragrance and linen, of powders and pomanders, of rare baths undertaken with ceremony and fear, a world where the body was wrapped, guarded, and masked, never wholly bare, never wholly cleansed. And though centuries have passed, the whisper remains, echoing through history like a scent that lingers in an old hall, that once, long ago, nobles lived lives apart from water, and in doing so, created one of the strangest and most enduring stories of the human past. And so, the tale draws to its close. You have walked through cities of shadow and stench, watched kings drenched in fragrance, seen children swaddled like glass, and stood in chambers where water was both temptation and terror. You have followed the slow rhythm of the seasons, the stern voice of the church, the disbelief of foreign eyes, and the cautious breath of the Renaissance. And now, in the memory of it all, you hear the ghost of the legend still, the story of an age when the noble feared the bath, and perfume was their shield against a world they could not master.